Okay, well, welcome so much to the panel on embracing the next decade, right? So, in this panel, we want to talk about what are some of the global forces and issues that we have to pay attention to in our foreign policy within the next 10 years. And I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel. And this is a very distinguished panel, I should say, because it features Indonesian women leaders who are experts on their own fields, movers and shakers. They are recognized for what they do, and I'm very pleased to be a moderator in this panel. When we designed this panel at FPCI, we think about embracing the future. So when we talk about embracing the future, of course, we are thinking about who will be leading our foreign policy in the future, who will be shaping the strategic direction of where Indonesia is going to go. And one thing came to mind, which is women, because women is the largest untapped reservoir of talent in the world, and that is said by Hillary Clinton. So when we go around with our partners and we say that, hey, I think we need a lot of training and empowerment for Indonesian women in foreign policy. There needs to be more voices, more participation, because the future should be diverse and inclusive. So we are very happy that when we talk to the United States Embassy, they are very supportive of our mission. And with that, we have partnered with the US Embassy in Jakarta to create this program called Women in Foreign Policy, whereby we will train Indonesian women to further elevate their foreign policy profile, amplify their voices on the stage, and of course, train the next generation leaders in foreign policy for Indonesian women. So with that, this is actually the launching panel, a soft launching panel for that program. And I'm so happy to welcome Rachel Cook on behalf of the US Embassy. She is the Minister Counselor for Public Affairs. So please give it up for Rachel.
Thank you, Esther. Hi, everybody. It's really my pleasure to be here from the embassy. I have the opportunity as our leader of public diplomacy to really engage with Indonesians all across the country to help to continue to build the good relationship that we have and that we have built since before World War II even. And this event here today is part of that. As Esther mentioned, we are very pleased to partner with FPCI on this Women in Foreign Policy initiative. Starting today, it's a year-long initiative. It will work with mid-career women who are in foreign policy already to help them hone their skills to really move to the next level. And this is something that we're seeing as a problem, not just in Indonesia, but all over the world. From things as simple as women not being called on to ask a question or to give their input, to women not being able to be found to speak on panels as experts. We can't always rely on Professor Dewi, right? We need others as well. And to women not being able to find mentors to help them develop and grow in this field. So that's what this year-long program will do, and it will include public discussions that partner participants in the program with US policy experts throughout the year. So we're really looking forward to it. Thank you for letting us kick this off. And I also want to give a little bit of background in why this is so important to me. More than 2 decades ago, when I decided I wanted to join the Foreign Service, I looked into it and discovered I did not have the right background. I did not study political science or law or international relations. I'm a science girl. I had a background in environmental management and marine biology. And when I decided to go through the process to join our diplomatic corps, I was asked in an interview by a panel of all men senior diplomats why they should pick me. What value would I bring to the Foreign Service? And I had to tell them, right then and there, I had to come up with a very good answer. And what I said was, if you have a bunch of people sitting around a table and they're trying to come up with solutions to some big international problem, or even a little international problem, and they all have a background in political science or international relations or law, you're going to get the same solutions over and over again. But I bring a different perspective. I come with a science perspective. I have a different point of view. And the value basically that I would be bringing is I would be bringing different solutions. Maybe some of them would be good, maybe some of them wouldn't be so good, but they would be additional valuable options. And this is the important part for all the women in this room and frankly, everyone. You have value. What is your value? When someone says to you, why should we select you? Why should you sit at the table? Why should we care about your opinion? You need to be able to know how to answer that question. How do you express the value that you bring? Because you are incredibly valuable in the foreign policy sphere, and we want you there. So I basically talked my way into the Foreign Service. And then about a decade later, I volunteered for service in Afghanistan. And once again, this came up. Why would we want women to serve in Afghanistan? What would be the value of having you go to Afghanistan? You might just be a liability there. I knew that they needed volunteers, so I just said, I think you're just gonna send me because I'm volunteering. But once I was there, I was able to reach back to the folks in Washington and tell them the value of having women there. For one thing, all of the men with whom I interacted, the Afghan men who were leading ministries and universities and media outlets, they saw me as a US diplomat first. They did not see me as a woman first. So I had no problems interacting with them and doing all the same work with them that I would do anywhere else around the world. So that was not a problem. But secondly, I could do something that none of my male colleagues could do. I could go to women-owned businesses and talk to those women. I could go to women-run all-girl madrasas and talk to the girls and talk to the women, the educators. I could go to women's homes and celebrate holidays with them and their families. My male colleagues could not do any of those things. So ultimately, I told our folks back in Washington, the value is I can interact with 100% of the population in Afghanistan. Know your value, know how to express it, and we're looking forward to working with you this year to learn how to do that. Thank you very much for coming. And we're very excited for our panelists today. Thank you very much. Esther.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that inspirational remarks. And I can tell that many of the young women here in this room will probably apply for this program. So please stay tuned for that. But as I said earlier, this panel is really special because what we're going to do in the next hour is we're going to try to predict Indonesia's foreign policy future, right? Embracing the next decade, what are the global forces and what are some of the issues that we need to look at now in order to gain a competitive advantage in the future? So with that, let me welcome our distinguished speakers. First, please welcome Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar, the co-founder of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and research professor at LIPI. We would also like to welcome Andini Effendi, a renowned independent journalist with many accolades, and she's no need for introduction. Everybody knows who she is. And can we also give a round of applause for Afu Tami, a climate activist, environmental economist, and CEO of Think Policy. So please welcome me and join me in welcoming them again one more time and give them a huge round of applause. Okay, so as I said, we only have 60 minutes. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to shot some questions directly to Prof. Dewi, Andini, and Afu Tami. And I'd love to open the floor to questions later on. Any questions that you got, we got a very great lineup here, so please feel free to ask away. You can always, signal the officers here, and then we'll be very happy to take your question. So, Prof. Dewi, this panel wants to talk about Indonesia's foreign policy future. And recently, Indonesia has successfully wrapped its G20, and it seems that Indonesia is now on the limelight of the global stage. We got ASEAN chairmanship next year, but can you tell us a little bit more? What's the future there? What should we do in order to embrace the next decade?
Thank you very much, Asad. Firstly, I would like to thank all of you who are so committed to sit through the lunchtime. So that means that you are real diehards foreign policy lovers. And secondly, I would like to thank Ibu Rachel Cook for that wonderful and inspirational spiel for why, to make a difference and women matters. And then it just so happens that we are all women panels here, yeah, but it doesn't mean that we are discriminating against the men, right?
No.
No. Now, if Esther, if I remember correctly, the title of this panel is actually The Global Forces and the Issues which we need to pay attention to, particularly the Indonesians' foreign policy. Now, Ibu Rachel said she's a scientist. When you're talking about forces, there are two types of forces. There are centripetal forces, forces that bring you together, and there are centrifugal forces, forces that separate you. And it's up to us. I'm not going to tell you which forces would divide and which forces would unite, because in fact, that is a challenge when foreign policy, how a particular country deals with those forces. Do we accentuate the differences, or do we actually actively try to bring them together? Are we parts of the forces that try to polarize, or are we part of the forces that try to unify? Now, the G20 is a good start, because the issues that came out in the G20, particularly the priorities that Indonesia brought together, are actually the global forces which will continue to determine our future. The first, then foremost, and in the past, the only one that really matters is the geopolitics. Because in the past, countries made peace, countries made wars, and those are the primary issues, the primary drivers of international relations. So geopolitics cannot be wished away. And recently also now, you cannot separate between geopolitics and geoeconomics, because geopolitics directly impact on economic relations, and economic capabilities also and policies also directly impact political international relations, and goes to the third dimension, geosecurity, because it relates to peace and war and peace straight away. So the geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geosecurity become, this is the staples of IR students' policies. But now, increasingly, as we know, and we have the panels to say here, when we look at the issues that Indonesia drove, we didn't think that illness, that pandemic, would in fact overwhelm the entire planet, yeah? That it would actually impact directly on all of those forces and the issues of our common humanity. How do we deal with transnational threats, non-traditional security threats? And pandemic is one of the top issues now that I don't think that we can wish it away, because the permutations of viruses seems to be continuing. So this, I think, will be here to stay. This is the new normal. Us wearing masks will be a new normal for the for foreseeable future. Although if you go to Europe or Australia now or the United States, people do not wear that mask anymore. But as we know that every so often it will come again. Secondly, the issues of climate change. How our behavior, our industrial development, our drive for economic growth have directly also impacted on the health of our planet. So this is the climate change issue, and how we try to mitigate that risk, I think will continue to be a main agenda for the foreseeable future. I will not touch too long on here. And thirdly, of course, one of the enabler for the good or for the bad is technology. How our lives in this, in this past 200 years have been shaped by very much by the technology, transportation technologies, weapons, and communication technologies. And now everyone is focused on digital because this is really something that is very new and it has affected our life very, very much. It affects how we deal with each other in daily communication. It affects how we manage our education system, and the COVID restrictions, work from home, distance learning, and so on, have been made possible by the presence of the digital technology. But at the same time, we also look at the negative impacts of it, about cyber threats, about fake news, about increasing polarizations. The polarizations in the geopolitics have been exacerbated by the digital technology as well, where people are talking to their echo chambers. Only, the algorithm only can target certain groups so that they feed them certain opinions. This was very prevalent, for example, before the US elections, the elections of President Trump's, where the divides, between the Democrats and the Republicans, where there's no middle ground anymore, and it's to a certain extent it's exacerbated by that and before Brexit also, that was also very, very clear. And in our elections, I imagine that we had that in the gubernatorial elections, and I'm sure that and then the presidential election also that is also going to happen. So there's digital transformations about how it will affect the economy, who will be the winners and who will be the losers, how it will affect societies and so on. That will be a lot of one of the main drivers. And finally, because my area of specialization is geopolitics, there is a tendency to focus only on the two superpowers. So, we are fixated, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, the rise of China, what it means to the regional order and the global order, and then how the United States as the incumbent superpower responds to this rising power. Is conflict inevitable? That we are all fixated on that. So the US-China rivalry is the primary narrative. The foreseeable future, regardless of what happens between Russia and Ukraine, the narrative of the US-China rivalry will continue to be the primary drivers in the Indo-Pacific. But they are not the only stories, because there are also other major powers in the region whose policy also matters. And there are also middle powers whose policy matters also. And here, the role of India, the role of Japan, and the middle powers, Indonesia, and organizations like ASEAN. So do not allow the superpowers to dominate and monopolize the narratives. Because what happens in G20 shows clearly that the middle powers, those who work for the centripetal forces, actually can have a very important role to play. And I hope that continues to inform our foreign policy, whether next year in ASEAN or for the next decade. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Dewi, for that very strategic overview. And you've touched on a lot of elements, which is why I want to move on to Mbak Andini. Ibu Dewi mentioned that there's this competition of narratives. And we know that in a digitized era and an information age, that information comes at every angles at you, all kinds of narratives. Now, you're an expert in media. Can you please tell us how that information age and then the role of media has shaped the way civil societies think about our foreign policy, of our diplomatic approach? Particularly, we can tell for some examples, the Russia-Ukraine war is one, and then many others that I should not, I can go on and on, but that's just one example. So over to you, Mba.
Okay, before I answer your question, I would like to ask the audience here, who here still watch TV? Raise your hand. Who here watch TV for the news? Okay, still minority. Who here got their news from social media? Who here watches YouTube more than they watch TV? So it's sort of give background to your question, how the media shape the role of civil society, etc. Is because it's not the media per se anymore. We are all giving information to each other, even though it's through social media or YouTube or whatever. But we sort of wants to share that information. And I think that is again, echoing what Ibu Dewi said about technology, played a huge role in shaping our society as it is now. So do I think that media is still relevant to talk about? Yes, of course, because Ibu Dewi still raised her hand. However, I believe we as a citizens, we become more and more sophisticated to understand, to get what we want, to basically filter what we need to hear, to listen, to watch. So, and that I as a media person, that's why I resigned from mainstream media, is because I see the trend is coming, and then we're losing the audience because we're not serving the audience anymore. We're serving the two gods, which is the advertisers and the media owner. So that is why I choose to be independent, so I can just basically follow the wave, what is going on, and also follow my passion. But that's the beauty of the transformation that has been going on, I guess, in the world, particularly in Indonesia, because you have the young generations who basically trying to move away from the classic old-fashioned media. And sekarang, I want to ask you, who here still posted on Twitter? Pre-Elon Musk, okay? Pre-Elon, who's posting, tweeting about stuff? What about Instagram? Okay, sharing information. Sharing information. TikTok. Okay, so we have a slightly older audience here, which we can relate, because I'm not on TikTok too. Okay, so here's the thing though. So we are all sharing information to others, and I guess that's something that we should be wary of, because is it true or not? You cannot really verify the legitimacy of the information. But also there's a like the light at the end of the tunnel where people actually care about things. People actually care about what's going on, not only in Indonesia, but also in the world, and then share it to their audience. So I guess I'm not too concerned but this is a trend that we need to really be watchful for.
A follow-up question to that, Mbak Andini. You mentioned that everybody is connected, right? So in 2017, 27 billion of devices are connected to the internet. But it's predicted that by 2030, so in about 8 years, there will be 127 billion devices connected to the internet, which means that everybody is free to share their own opinion, their own views, whether or not they're right or wrong, whether or not they're feeding to a certain theory, conspiracy theory. So there's a lot of concern and risk of misinformation and disinformation, especially at this age where narrative campaign is all the rage. So can you share us some of your thoughts about that and whether or not Indonesia has guarded ourselves well for that?
So this is interesting. So I always think that the war on narratives is our World War V, I guess. So we have World War I, World War II, and then World War III, the Cold War. And then World War IV was the war on terror. And then now we have war on narratives. And then it will still keep going on because we are so used to holding to this, right? So it's good and bad. And then do I think that we as Indonesians are prepared for that? Well, we have the draft of criminal code who's trying to say protect us to do it, but that's up for discussion. But we need to have guards, I believe. We do, because we don't want to share the narratives. It's not even information anymore. I have my own narrative. Ibu Dewi has her own narrative that we share to others. That it's like when we share, we don't know the impact of it, the domino effect of the narrative that we share to others, right? So in a way, yeah, we do need to be careful of what we say, but at the same time, as we are, still a young population, and then people are still, as you say, now we're gonna have more devices, but are they ready to be so engaged in it and use it mindfully, So then again, it's up to debate, because we do need some regulation to really protect us, but it has to be coming also, that the government or whoever doing this regulation needs to hear also what the public says.
And I think this is certainly one of the issues that are still developing. We don't have the answer to it just yet. because it relates back to the bigger question about democracy, protection of freedom of speech, and what does this mean in this digitized era? And I'd love to come back to you later about that. But in the meantime, I want to pose a very serious question because I do believe that what I'm about to ask is the mother of all problems. The climate crisis. And Afutami here is an expert, an advocate for that, very renowned for her work. And as we're talking about the next decade, so 2030, everybody keeps saying it's the deciding decade for climate action. And can you give us a little context of why that is and what's the point of no return that 2030 represents?
Thanks, Esther. This is such a great opportunity. It feels a lot like coming home because I am actually an international relations graduate first, before everything that you saw on the screen earlier. So very, very happy to be amongst, IR enthusiasts, movers, activists as well. I just want to start with maybe like a quick show of hands as well in terms of who here are feeling or have had moments of climate anxiety in the past, I don't know, year at least. Okay, I see. Okay, I was hoping for more, but a few of you does. So I have had these moments, right? Like these points of where I seriously try to imagine what would 2030 look like. Like seriously, like not just thinking, oh, the future, blah, blah, blah. Like sometimes we're so lost in all these big words and all these big concepts, but we stop at like not actually visualizing what our daily life, literally day-to-day life would look like. And for me, in the year of 2030, I will be 38 years old, right? That's like the prime age where as a younger person, I was thinking, by that time, I would like to already be somewhat in a more higher up level in my professional career journey, and I was expecting that even further down the road, right, by 2050, when I'm 58 and about to retire, I wanted a life of retirement that is, nice. I would have a house, hopefully, like a retirement house, and I would live with my family and all of that. But now, when I think about what that future looks like, I'm thinking about a permanently flooded city. I'm thinking that my body would already be full of ache, back pain, being old, right? Like back pain, all sorts of things. And then I still have to deal with flood outside of my house. I still have to deal with the food crisis that we will be experiencing. Like, I wouldn't be having the coffee that I so love every day anymore because the supply of coffee would be significantly impacted. Days would be really hot. We will, really rely on AC probably, or a different kind of AC because we have to stop using AC at some point as well. So it's a very bleak future. So if you're not worried, and I hate myself for doing this, but I feel like maybe more of us should be more worried. Like really think about what retirement days would look like for us. Maybe most of you will not retire yet by 2050, but you'll be in your 40s probably, right? We're around that age. So the scientists have been warning us a lot in the past 20 years or even more, right? They have seen the trends. The science have clearly shown how the trajectories of global warming will really impact a few things. Basically, they've been saying that the future will be really hot. It'll be really warm. It'll be really wet at the same time. It'll be full of diseases. If you think that the pandemic that we've experienced was so bad, oh, trust me, a bigger wave is coming. And I'm not a fan of doing this, right? Like, and bringing up this narrative because I feel like every single time I feel like I'm the doomsday barrier. I always keep repeating this bad news, but I don't think people have realized how urgent and how big the issue is. Or people have, and many of, I think more, if I go to social media, more young people are feeling climate anxious. It's a real anxiety, but I think there's a gap in terms of the people who are feeling anxious might not be the ones who are making the decisions per se. So we are speaking up, we are communicating, but at the end of the day, it will really rely on the global leaders, both in the public sector and the business sector. And so many maybe climate activists in Indonesia, usually when they talk about climate change, they're thinking about how Indonesia can mitigate its emissions, right? But me, having the international relations background, first, climate change to me is first a foreign policy issue second, a domestic policy issue, particularly for Indonesia, right? Because and it's a very unique position as well to be Indonesia, right? Because we are, well, if you look at the history, there's been, one of the frameworks that I learned early in IR as well is this concept of common but differentiated responsibility, which I think does have a certain, a valid point, right? In a sense that the level of emissions that we see today in our atmosphere at the end of the day, really started in the Western Europe with the Industrial Revolution. It has surpassed, it has overshot the a level of what is actually acceptable. It has created or led to global warming, and so on and so forth. But indeed, the trend has shifted where now the global south, I guess, the more developing nations are catching up, I guess, in terms of emissions number, right? But what that does tell us is not necessarily to point finger at each other, and that has been the trend in the past, and that's kind of one of the reasons why we've been in this gridlock for so long in terms of actions, because the global north is like, no, but now the global south is emitting more. But then on the other hand, historically, you guys need to provide more resources, and it's kind of stuck there. When in reality, what it should have done, and I really love how Prof. Dewi earlier talked about centrifugal and centripetal forces, forces, how that should have been a center. Which one gets us together? Centripetal. Centripetal, yes. It should have brought us together. It's a common crisis that climate change will affect every single nation, right? So it should be a force that gets all of us together the same way that the pandemic has did, right? But at the same time, even during pandemic, we see that there's still political divisions. There's different allocation of vaccines. All of that is still there, and this is of course also then prevalent in the case of climate change. That being said, Esther, just to switch maybe to a more optimistic tone a little bit, there has been a lot of progress that we can celebrate in the past, few years. It is going to the right trend, but it's just not at the right speed. So this is what worries me. I think in terms of the trend, we have the Paris Agreement in 2015. That's a monumental milestone where all 190 something countries come together and agreed that there is a goal. At least we agree on the goal. That's big in international relations, right? If you come from IR background, that's big. We agreed on the goal. So that's why I think now we're entering the decade of solutions, of climate solutions. And that can have its own diplomatic challenges. It can have its own negotiation process. The age of solutions should have come 10 years sooner, but at least we're here. One of the big achievements, for example, for the government of Indonesia is how in G20 summit just a few weeks back, right? Indonesia managed to get the commitment from G7 countries, for example, to help finance Indonesia's own transition out of coal. Right? This is 20 billion commitment over the next few years, coming in different forms, so grants, loans, everything, but to help our country kind of phasing out from coal. And this is so important. Again, in the case of Indonesia, it's so unique because we are both, a big emitter. We're struggling with our addiction to coal. I think we realize it. I think the political leaders realize it and is trying to find a way to actually, transition out. It's difficult, but we should be moving towards that direction. At the same time, we're also very vulnerable. We're still part of the global south that is being affected by climate change more than most countries. So we're at the top third countries actually most affected by climate change. So we're also, we should be mobilizing financing for resilience, to build our cities to be more resilient towards flooding. We just earlier, a few months back, right, Jakarta was basically kind of like stopped moving because of a series of flooding. So that's a big issue. So Indonesia is really at the center of this, both as part of the emitting countries, but also the one affected by climate change. And our leadership in Southeast Asia, and maybe later we can talk about the ASEAN leadership as well, is so important. We're a big country, we're a big democracy in this region, and how we can work together with other ASEAN countries and in mobilizing support would be really critical. I think I'll start with that.
Thank you. So I think Afu just summed up international climate diplomacy in basically 5 minutes or less. So thank you for that. And I'd love to come back to Prof. Dewi about this because we have seen this pattern that the world is becoming more divided. more dangerous, more polarized, but at the same time, we're facing a universal issue, which is the climate crisis. But still, all that everybody talks about is US versus China. So is this still the song that we will sing to for the next 10 years, Ibu Dewi? And if that shouldn't be, then what kind of world order should Indonesia want?
Yeah, sometimes we feel, when we listen to these transcendental forces, like, and the climate change issues is transcendental forces that, affect us all. Pandemics affects us all. Logically, countries should work together, right? But from experience, we have seen what happened during the pandemic, for example. The pandemic itself became a very contested issue. How it started out, how it spread, and how the vaccines would be produced, how they're distributed, became a contested issue. And when, the climate change issue also became a contested issue, not just internationally, but also domestically. So just wishing countries to work together clearly is not important. And here the role of science, Rachel, it is up to those with the knowledge, those with the objective knowledge, not the subjective, politically driven and politically biased knowledge, need to be able to speak up. Usually foreign policy makers do not listen to them, the scientists. There are those who don't believe in science either. And Andini, I'm sorry, if you allow the media and the Vox Populi simply to drive the narratives, you're not going to be able to get the rational scientists have a hearing. And this is why conventional media is going to continue to be very important. Those who will be able to say, these are true stories and these are not true stories. And truth is not always related to popularism or to majoritarianism. Yeah. So this is very important. That how do you need evidence-based policy? And that is very short at the moment to get this evidence-based policy. The US-China narratives will continue to be drivers, but politics are people. And Ibu Reno said, it's not just countries making policies, it's people making policies. Personal relations do matter. I do not think the Biden Xi meeting in Bali will structurally will fundamentally change the structures, the difference between China. But I hope that they will reduce the tension and will make it possible for them to work on issues that do matter. And Dino challenged, Dr. Dino, in his opening remarks said, if the US and China can find a common project in Southeast Asia, that will be very substantive, that will be very, the visually would be very good. And what areas could they work with? On issues of climate would be one area where they could work. So as I say, at the end of the day, politics do matter, and the politicians matter. There is a tendency in all countries, politicians get the lowest approval rating. Yeah, we don't trust them and so on. But without the politicians, no decision will be made. So it is very important not to demonize your politicians, not to dismiss your politicians. But how do you educate your politicians? How do you engage your politicians and make sure that they make the right policies? And that is a challenge for us all. So that means, do not look at politics and say, itu politik kotor. Now, if you're not willing to clean it up, who is going to clean it up? Yeah. So that is also a challenge. Politics matter, guys, at the end of the day.
Right.
I saw you nodding, so I think you want to comment.
I think I just want to comment on that. So if talking about, I agree that mainstream media still play a huge role in the society to choose which one is validating the information or not. But come to like what we're talking about now, if we're talking about climate issues, I was like fighting to talk about sustainability, climate change, environmental issues, but it will always be labeled as, oh, itu isu lingkungan. As long as the mindset of people behind the news desk that is not a livelihood issue, then we will never get to a point where we all here got a climate anxiety. You know what I mean? So I understand why people start to look further for source of information regarding, hey, let's say what they need is that, oh, Jakarta banjir, oh, itu pasti salah Anies. It's not. we all have a role in it too, right? So, and I guess what the narrative, the national media right now, they don't get into the depth of the information to make us get better knowledge of what's going on. Banjir is not just banjir. Banjir is related to what Afu was talking about, right? So, and that's why I agree, we still need to have like, harus dikontrol gitu, mana yang this is the valid news, mana yang enggak. Tapi I don't blame people if they start to like move away from the mainstream media. And then I hope that, you know, they're not spreading hoax, yeah, but they start looking for useful source of information so they can do something about it, including the climate issues.
Relating to that, so you mentioned that Indonesia needs to guard itself well, and there needs to be some sort of regulation to fact check what's valid and what's not valid. I want to ask your opinion. Do you think that we're entering an age of more polarization within societies because of this competing information? And what can we do in Indonesia, right, in our foreign policy, in our diplomatic approach, even in our public policy, to make sure that this divergences does not become too wide that we can't get anything done?
Well, do you think that we are more polarized, guys, as a society? Berpikir nggak kita tuh sekarang lebih terpolarisasi? Sangat kan? I mean, is actually we're getting towards that because of like kebablasan informasi, because like we can find our own sources, etc. Right? So do you think that you asked me if we need like a proper regulation to have this? Yes, we do, but it needs to be talked about also to public, right? Because that's the I guess the pros and cons of having this revision of the criminal code is that we feel the civil society was not being included in that discussion, right? But at least this is on a very limited knowledge that I know, because there's so many resistance towards it. But yeah, we do need something like to guard us. So kayak Ibu bilang tadi, so ada yang bisa memvalidasi which one is the facts and which ones are not, right?
If I can jump here a moment, if you look at the Bali Declaration on the G20s, on the digital transformation, that's first on the infrastructure, you know, providing equal access to digital justice. So it's not limiting it, but making it more accessible to all. But number two is digital literacy. So it's not about regulation so much as about informing people more, so that we are more critical consumers of information and news. And I'm not talking about education here, because apparently they did a survey in America where they send so-called facts to various university lecturers and asking them, can they tell which are fake news and which are real news? Even university professors cannot always tell, because really clever fake news would always have some facts in it. Yeah. So here that means that it's a challenge, not just for us developing countries, but for everybody. And of course, you know, the cybersecurity, that's a law. So this is just jumping in here. So educating ourselves on critical thinking, it becomes very important. And that means that, you know, not to play to the echo chamber. Yeah.
Afu, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I just think that all of us agree that I think we want more democratization of information, but a stronger accountability mechanism, right? So it's about, so the pendulum between traditional media with social media helps us to democratize the, you know, sources of information more, which is good to a certain extent, right? Because there's no, you know, few media, how do you call them, like, conglomerates who are dictating the type of information, the only type of information that we can have, right? So we democratize it, but we also want the accountability in terms of, you know, a degree of like how do you verify or have a sense of this information is accountable versus this other information. And at the heart of it, just kind of echoing what Prof. Dewi earlier said, are the consumers themselves need to be better critical thinkers.
And I think this is really important for us to take this seriously, because as we know that eventually domestic policy or domestic attention do shape foreign policy in a way that we need to prioritize what's going on as well in our domestic constituencies and bring it outward. How can we deliver for our people? How can we deliver for our citizens?
I would like to add one more to that. So speaking of constituency and climate issues, there's one survey, a recent survey, you can check about this, asking young voters which type of politicians they want to vote. And number one are the politicians who care about the environment, about climate change. They don't go into details what's going on in that, but their concern is that the natural disaster, still very basic, but at least that gives some hope that people want change,
Yes.
and they understand that change can be brought by the politicians who sit making regulations. So I feel like that's
Exactly.
good. Yeah, that's a good ini.
And it just so happens that we have a climate agenda panel right after this, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, I'd love to open the floor for questions. Kalau ada yang ingin bertanya, bisa langsung angkat tangan aja. Okay, so many hands. So the gentleman right here in the middle, there are 3 of them. We'll take 3 at a time so that we can accommodate for more questions. You can introduce your name, your institutional affiliation, or where you're traveling from if you're outside Jakarta.
Okay, thank you, ma'am, for the time. I would.
Do you mind speaking louder?
My name is Bintang Betengor Tikon. I'm a graduate of the Pan Federal in Jakarta, and yeah, stay here, live here. I would like to ask about regarding the China and Taiwan conflict in the region, since what the challenge of the next 10 years Indonesia should wrestle, since the Indo-Pacific projection by the United States and of course its allies as well is one of the predominant issues in this region. And of course, Indonesia is one of the largest nations in the Indo-Pacific as well. So what could we respond if China will attack Taiwan in the coming years? And of course, we may not know that whether China will do that or not, like Russia do to Ukraine right now. And of course, regarding, since lots of Indonesian people are working in Taiwan, what will we do? Are we going to evacuate them, or are we going to anticipate this or participate in this conflict? And of course, this involving lots of souls, innocent people in this case. And of course, we are talking about climate change or jobs or anything as well, but we must not forget about the situation right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And the second asker, please. If you don't mind raising your hand again. Yeah, that one at the back. And then the lady over on the left-hand side.
Okay, my name is Daniel. I'd like to ask to Bu Dewi Fortuna Anwar. As we know, Chinese military emerged recently. So many Asian countries are worried about its military emerge by climbing islands in South China Sea and also higher tension with Taiwan. So what do you think, how do our government respond for such situation in the next 10 years, few or 10 years?
Thank you.
Then for about military exercise, we know that Indonesia usually conduct the exercise with American and Australia. So do you think, is it possible if we conduct a military exercise with China and also Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. Penanya ketiga di sebelah kiri sini, mohon dibantu.
Okay, Chair. Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Mika Angelia and I'm from Christian University of Indonesia. I'm an international relations student as well. So from the discussion before, I wrote some of points that might could, be probably a little discussion for trade-off this beautiful and wow, such a wonderful speakers. So I wrote something about the trends and the networks. I believe that the power, right now, the contemporary world and the system right now, the power relies to the networks, right? And when I heard something about the trends, when I heard something about what policies should we do to counter the networks, the threat of the networks in especially in Indonesia, so we could escape in the form of Indonesia. So this is the question from me: is that what is that the threat of solution for the network? Because when I heard the discussion before, I feel that there's something that's not really I still didn't get the answer of the solution. So when I said the power relies to the power relies to the network, it says that there also should be a solution to create some policies inside that. So what is the solution to counter the network trends, especially in Indonesia? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll give the, of course, hard security questions to Prof. Dewi, and then the question from the lady to Afu, and then to Mbak Andi.
Thank you. The first and the second question is actually more related. It's about China. China, it's about the China's military might and what its policy would be, whether it's towards Taiwan and towards the South China Sea. I think we are all extremely concerned about that. And in fact, one of the issue about the Russian invasion of Ukraine that makes a lot of people very nervous is, would something happen? The same thing would happen. Will China, for example, intervene militarily in Taiwan, particularly when every time there's elections in Taiwan that elect more democratic leaders who are critical of Beijing, there tends to be a lot of military exercises and so on. And with the visit from the speakers, Nancy Pelosi, U.S. speaker to Taiwan, you can see, the China's reaction was very, very strong. So clearly, we will hope that nothing really bad would happen, because firstly, if China does attack Taiwan, willy-nilly, it would engage the United States. And that is inevitable, because the United States does have the Taiwan Relations Act, which says that, the United States has to come to the rescue of Taiwan. So the two superpowers will be clashing head to head. And when it comes to real military power, regardless of China's rapid rise, the fact that its economy is probably going to surpass the US, probably already surpassing the US. When you look apple to apple in terms of military capability, the US military expenditure still is much greater than all of the major powers. If you put all the P5 countries together, exclude the United States, all the P4 countries, plus other big countries that spend a lot on the military, the US still has more. The US still has more nuclear powerheads, has more aircraft carriers, more fighter aircraft, and so on. So it will be suicidal. It will be suicidal of China to really challenge the US head to head. So, and I think it would be foolish of China not to think that the US will come. But for China, the cost is much greater than for Russia invading Ukraine, because precisely Russia invaded Ukraine before Ukraine is part of NATO. So there is, Ukraine is given logistical support by NATO countries, given financial support, but NATO has been very cautious of not becoming directly engaged, because if NATO is directly attacked, it will clearly transform the conflict. That's why, you know, when there was concern about the missile that hit Poland, when I was asked, you know, is that Russian missile? I said it's very unlikely because that would be very foolish, you know, for Russia to directly engage NATO. So if you look at it, you know, logically, it will be not just suicidal, not just very damaging to the Indo-Pacific region, but suicidal for China's health and prosperity and so on, because it will not be able to stop, you know, direct confrontation with the United States. But the most important thing, what is the difference? China's power depends very much on its economic capability now. China is the largest trading nation in the world. And for a trader, the most important thing is safety of navigation. If you get disruption in the South China Sea, in the North China Sea, for a long period of time, China's exports to the world will be disrupted. China's imports of raw materials will be disrupted. So logically, it is not in China's interest to stir the boat too much, because real conflicts, like for example, like in the Black Sea where grains cannot go out, if China's exports cannot go out to the world, China's economy would be starved of growth. So that is why I say, you know, because China's economy is already so integrated since it joins WTO, it's become the main supplier of industrial growth, of manufacturing in all over the world. And also it's very dependent on raw materials from other parts of the world. So China actually needs a lot of stability. Now, for us in the region, what is our policy? We engage with China. We make it important for China to be part of a peaceful neighborhood, because being part of a peaceful neighborhood is good for China's own prosperity. But at the same time, we have to tell China where the red lines are. And that's why also, you know, we ASEAN countries, individual countries in the region have also carried out what we call self-help, modernizing its own defense policy, defense system, like in Indonesia, through our minimum minimum growth itu for our defense, but also carrying carrying military cooperation with other countries, you know, this joint exercises and so on with the United States and so on. The question, do we carry out exercises with China? We do. Indonesia also carries out, we have a comprehensive strategic partnership with China that also includes cooperation in the security area. We carry out also bilateral naval cooperation. For example, last year, after the Garuda Shield between the US and Indonesia, Indonesia carried out a smaller scale naval cooperation with China.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Prof. Dewi. Unfortunately, that our time is almost running out. But the question earlier that was posed to Andini and Afu is, what's the solution, right? So I'm going to offer the floor to Andini and then Afu. What's the solution to first democratizing the information age, but also maintaining what's fake and what's not, and how do we maintain that, right, in the next coming decade? Because that's going to be so important on narratives, as well as a closing statement. And then for Afu, how can we intertwine our foreign policy more with our climate action and our strategic vision for a net zero world?
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Esther, and thanks for that question. I actually want to tie the two together a little bit in terms of the information age vis-a-vis climate change, right? Because I think like one of the questions you had was how to give more power to the network, and there's this very excellent study done by a professor at Harvard University, which shows that basically as in the past, like historical social movements that always succeeded, if at least 3.5% of the population, so that's the magic number, 3.5% of the population cares about an issue and does, well, the way that he framed it is civil disobedience, but meaning, you know, protests to the street, of course in a, you know, non-violent way, but kind of like speaking up and really taking up the public space, then historically that always translates into change. So that 3.5% number is the magical number, right? Now you translate that 3.5% out of 270, 280 million people. That translates to about 10 million. I think someone who's better at math, please do the calculation. But basically, the question now is how do you get to 10 million people, for example, to care about climate change so that domestically, the political leaders take more action. But of course, it should also translate to even stronger foreign policy, foreign diplomacy, and how we try to mobilize international resources for Indonesia, for example. So, and to get to 10 million, there's so many different barriers, right? One that I see is how every time someone tries to talk about climate change to me, they will always start with an apology. Ini aneh banget. But they will start with, maaf Mbak Afu, saya bukan orang lingkungan, tapi saya mau tahu tentang climate change gitu. Minta maaf dulu. And I'm like, well, you don't have to apologize. If you want to learn about climate change, that's great. And what that got me thinking is, why do we need to apologize? Like as though climate change is exclusive to the environment, group, right? When in reality, climate change is about poverty. Climate change is about where the economy is going. It's such a current affairs issue that everyone should care about. How are we talking about war? How is everyone talking about war without apologizing, but talking about climate change starting with an apology? So the narrative really needs to be flipped that climate change is a mainstream issue, that it's affecting everyone's well-being. It's a well-being issue. It's a health issue. It's a common issue. That's one barrier to address. The second one, and this is so interesting, another study that we found is how when we talk about gender equality, right, we don't really talk about masculinity and how masculinity has shaped the public narrative, or like what especially the male community think about certain issues. In the environment, in the climate change issue, we might be losing 50% of the population to care about this, because the way that the way that masculinity has been defined or interpreted and passed on to the younger male generation is that caring is not cool. If you care, that's a very feminine thing. If you care about something, kayak peduli, kayak cowok itu nggak peduli gitu. And that's so it's a real research. It shows how environmental NGOs, not even just environment, right? Like even social issues are filled with female workers. The NGOs are filled with female workers, and that's so interesting. We're missing 50% of the population in the narrative. So I think part of it is also redefining, that caring is actually, how we redefine masculinity to also care about climate change. The 2 out of 3 gentlemen, out of the 3 askers, I guess, of today ask about war, but not about climate change. That's like just another interesting mirroring that I see. So finally with that, I think in terms of solutions, in terms of foreign policy, right? I think first and foremost, what is so important for Indonesia is like, how do we mobilize the resources? And I'm talking about climate financing, basically, right? Globally, there has been a commitment to mobilize $100 billion every year from the global North countries to help global South countries to deal with the climate transition, to build resilience. Last time in Glasgow, we saw that this commitment has not been met. So that's like a question of how do we mobilize more as we move forward. And Indonesia's leadership is so important in doing this. Secondly, at the same time, all this, like when we talk about climate financing, sometimes it's like a distraction from also thinking about how much money is actually still being channeled to the brown industry. So while we're fundraising for green financing, we should also not be distracted by looking at how money is still flowing into, brown industries.
Thank
and how
you,
should we
Afu. I
redirect
think I have to ask you to
more
wrap up very soon.
into the green sector. So I think that's it. Basically, mobilizing more commitment, using all the global coordination and diplomacy towards that goal. Thanks, Esther.
Okay, I'll be very brief. So we're talking about being a global force, right? As Indonesians and as a country. So before getting into this discussion, we had a discussion, and you talk about global issues. And I always say, like, why are we talking about global issues? Why don't we discuss something that is very Indonesia and then bring it to the global stage? Because that is how we can acknowledge what we have and then trying to find a solution, let's say about climate, human rights issues, freedom of speech, etc. And then starts to like create a buzz about it, because we're all buzzers, right? We're all impactors in a way, and then we can start talking about being that global force that Indonesia, the country, is needed. So of course, we care about what's happening in Iran or what's going on with China and the US. Yes, but look, I'm not saying we have to be inward looking, but see what we have here and then start to talk about it. And then we bring it to the global stage. Look what happened with G20. The economists put it so rightly that this is the overlooked giant. Because somewhat Indonesia we don't really know who are the Indonesians. What are the issues that we are facing? When we talk about climate change, it's because, there's, I don't know, Greta Thunberg, maybe. I don't know. But we have like so many other personalities, other issues that we can also discuss here and then bring it to the table, bring it to your own medium and start creating that narrative of being Indonesia as a global force.
Perfectly said, and I think that wraps up the end of this discussion. And I think what's really important for all of us to note is that this 70-minute discussion is nowhere near enough to talk about the various elements and forces that we actually have to decide and to discuss on when we talk about Indonesia's foreign policy. So earlier this year, there's an article on Asia Sentinel. It says Indonesia is the lion that meowed, right? And everybody was like, oh, is this true? Is this not?
Singa ompong.
Exactly. But after G20, after what our president of our foreign minister has shown, Indonesia can be a global force and is becoming one. Now, the question is for within the next decade, what kind of global force does Indonesia want to be? Do we want to be a global force that bring reforms, that brings change, that strives towards a net zero world, one that we actually desperately need right now? So having this panel has been a very good starting discussion towards that as we enter 2023. Next year, there's a lot of talk about global economic recession and then the ongoing energy crisis and food crisis and how that forces will shape our foreign policy remains to be seen. But thank you so much. So please allow us to together applaud our very distinguished speakers, Prof. Dewi, Bu Andini, and then Kak Afu for their amazing knowledge and wealth of experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther.